Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Reading Culture. Today we are going to look at the drama of William Shakespeare. We will eventually, in further videos over the next couple of weeks, be looking at the story of Henry V, King of England, as told by Shakespeare in the play of that name. However, to get an understanding of what Shakespeare is doing in his play, Henry V, we need to have an understanding of the drama of William Shakespeare more broadly. In order to do that, we need to go back even further into the past and see what was the dramatic tradition out of which Shakespeare was coming, and to which perhaps he was reacting. And even perhaps more broadly, what is it exactly that drama does? So to begin with, I would like to start with Aristotle. In Aristotle's Poetics, he makes certain distinctions about how we can categorize literature. So for example, we can think about form, or as he calls it, mode. We can think about subject. We can think about form or matter. So if we're thinking about matter according to Aristotle, we're thinking about things like the diction that is used in the language. Is it melodic, or is it meant to be accompanied by music? Does it have meter and rhythm? So if we're thinking about drama, it doesn't necessarily determine whether or not it's a play, if it's in prose, or if it's poetry. Many traditional forms of drama, in fact, use poetry, some kind of meter or rhythm. So, for example, in Shakespeare, we will see the use of blank verse in order to give it the rhythm that it has, but not always. Sometimes some parts of Shakespeare are in prose, some parts are in verse. Blank verse is iambic pentameter, but unrhymed, although often ending in rhyming couplets. We'll return to that in another video. The other way that Aristotle breaks down these kinds of distinctions is by subject. So what are the themes, right? Characters, the narrative, the plot. So in the case of classical drama, we would usually have tragedy on the one hand and comedy on the other. Now, comedy, while it could be humorous or funny, was not necessarily so. A comedy was a comedy because it ended happily. And a tragedy because, of course, it did not, right? It ended tragically. This distinction, of course, is going to still, to a degree, be present in Shakespeare. A Shakespearean comedy, while many of the most famous and popular ones are indeed quite funny and comedic in the modern sense, many are not. And indeed, near the end of his career, some of the plays would, while seemingly comedies in the sense that they end happily, are so foreign from the conventions of comedy that a new term is used to describe them, which is the romance. This would be a play such as The Tempest or A Winter's Tale. Another subject that will lead to a different generic distinction will be the history play, which is a play that may end happily or not, but it is not following the conventions of comedy or tragedy. And it is about a real historical person, usually a king, often the King of England, such as Henry V. And we will look at this genre a bit more later. And finally, we have mode as a distinction that Aristotle makes. So this could be something like oral narration, sung narration, or imitative performance. And of course, it is the imitative nature, the performative nature of drama that makes it drama. Even if you're reading it, you are still noting that this is meant to, in fact, be acted out. In the context of classical Greece, these plays would be acted out on a stage at a festival, in competition. And many of the great works of tragedy and comedy that are remembered were produced for this context. And classical Greece created a whole canon of comedy and tragedy by playwrights such as Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, which is the foundation stone, the basis of drama in the Western world. And this tradition was taken up and, in many ways, copied by the Romans, who produced their own canon in Latin of comedy and tragedy. This tradition, however, eventually fell away and really died completely in the West around the time of the fall of Rome, at least as it's generally conceived. And this tradition can really be seen as being, at least in most parts of the West, and certainly in a place like England, where it never really existed at all, completely severed. And so we get a different starting point for the most direct tradition out of which Shakespeare comes, and that is the dramatic tradition of the Middle Ages. And the dramatic tradition of the Middle Ages is quite different from the classical context. So for centuries, it doesn't really appear that drama exists in the kind of public or artistic life of medieval society. However, there is a dramatic element at the heart of that society. So the Middle Ages is, of course, a very religious time period. And the Catholic Mass is one of the central features of that culture. And it is itself, in a way, performative. There's something dramatic about it. The priest acts in persona Christi, which means in the person of Christ. He's reenacting, in a certain sense, the passion of Christ on the cross. Now, this is like drama, and already is introducing a kind of language of drama, in a sense of certain movements and certain actions, which are representing something beyond what the person himself is. But it's not truly drama, and certainly not in the classical sense. But we do get, coming out of the liturgy, so in the case of the West, we're talking about the Catholic Mass, mostly exclusively at this time period. So think about around the year 1000, for instance. Out of this comes liturgical drama. And liturgical drama is not actually a religious ceremony, but it is using similar kind of actions in a kind of performative language. So, for example, in a text called the Regularis Concordia, which is the rule of concord, it's a rule for monks. But in this, we get a description of a very interesting little, well, play, you could almost call it. It's some kind of liturgical drama. The monks play the Marys who are waiting outside of the tomb of Christ. And the monks basically play these roles. There's even a scene change as the Marys discover the tomb empty and Christ risen. This is, in many ways, the beginning of drama, of liturgical drama and of drama in the Middle Ages, at least in England. Now, from this, we start getting more elaborate liturgical dramas known as passion plays, dramatic representations of the passion of Christ on the cross. And not necessarily in a church, perhaps on a stage. And these become more elaborate and start taking on more and more aspects of the story of Christ. Maybe they start going beyond the passion. And so we get that next development in drama, the so-called mystery play. These mystery plays could be on any aspect of the Christian story in the Bible, everything from the fall of the angels and the creation of the world in Genesis through to Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt and parting the Red Sea to Christ and his apostles in the New Testament. These plays were not quite like we would think of as modern people, in that there weren't theaters. They were performed outside, often on carts. They were often put on and funded indeed by guilds. So the Blacksmiths Guild or the Carpenters Guild would maybe put on a particular play and you would form a sequence. The most famous of these is probably known as the York Cycle, which is a cycle of plays that covers the whole of Christian history of salvation. Now, these plays were immensely popular and were a centerpiece of medieval society in many towns, at least towns that were able to put them on, and particularly in England. This tradition was very, very vibrant and eventually expanded even beyond these mystery plays that are talking about a specifically biblical story to include a new development known as the morality play. In the morality play, you still get often Christian characters and Christian themes, but it's no longer specifically biblical. It could be, and it often was, allegorical representations of virtues and vices. One of the most famous of these morality plays is known as Everyman from the 15th century. And the main character is, surprisingly, right, representative of the everyman, journeying through, well, life, but also specifically the spiritual life. So this tradition is really the one that is native to England as opposed to the classical one. Now, it is quite vibrant right up into the 16th century. However, it does eventually fall away due to, in large part, the Protestant Reformation, which changes the cultural landscape of England, and liturgical drama and things like mystery plays and morality plays fall out of currency, you could say. That being said, this is close enough to the time of Shakespeare that these plays are directly informing the tradition in which he is writing. But the other tradition, so I mentioned the classical tradition, was dead, is revived, right? In the Renaissance, so-called, we see this rediscovery of classical drama. And in this rediscovery, people like Shakespeare are once again reading classical tragedy and comedy. And this is informing as well the construction of Shakespeare's drama, even though it is more directly coming out of this mystery and morality play tradition. It is really in the man, in the person of Shakespeare, that we see a synthesis, in many ways, of these traditions in the plays and the work, which is largely considered to be the greatest body of plays in the English language, at least, if not even perhaps overall. So that is the basic context. The world of Shakespeare's theater arose out of the mystery plays of the Middle Ages and from the revival of classical drama in the Renaissance. But what exactly does the professional world of drama look like in Shakespeare's period? Well, in the late 16th century, you have permanent playhouses beginning to be built. Before this, again, you had traveling groups of performers going around. You had plays being performed on wagons or temporary stages being built. But now we start getting permanent playhouses, which is indicative of the importance that drama is beginning to have in the public life of England, particularly. Now, these open-air playhouses could seat thousands of eager theater goers, right? These were not small things, especially because, of course, cities were much smaller than, including London. It's possible, in fact, that around 10% of the population of London went to the theater regularly. So that was a significant amount of the population to be, engaging in this kind of theatrical pastime. Now, there were certain seasons, like Lent, the season of fasting, which precedes Easter in the Christian liturgical calendar, when plays were not allowed to be performed. Moreover, because, as was mentioned, these were open-air plays, weather also determined whether or not plays could be performed. There were certain kind of limiting factors. In terms of what it would look like, you would have some scenery displayed, but the majority of the lavishness was really in the costumes, which were done up to represent the various periods of the plays. Special effects and other tricks of the stage were employed to dazzle the audience. You would have trap doors, and people could be lowered on cranes, and various kinds of pyrotechnics. Famously, the shooting off of a prop cannon during a performance of Shakespeare's play Henry VIII actually burned down the original Globe Theatre. So there were some risks to these kinds of tricks. Now, in competition with the outdoor theaters were the indoor theaters, which were, in theory at least, training boys around the ages of 8 to 16 in choir. However, they really were dramatical kinds of things. And in fact, it is here that we have the introduction of the intermission, which was necessary because of the great amount of candles that would need to be expended for an indoor performance. You'd have to replace them. Now, in the early 17th century, these indoor theaters came under the control of the same companies as the outdoor theaters, and we started seeing a merging of them. So what did these theatrical companies look like, such as the one in which Shakespeare is involved? So theatrical companies existed under noble or even royal patronage, at least in theory. So you'd have a noble, a duke or a count or someone who was basically putting that company kind of under his auspices, right? He might fund it, but also he gave it authority to exist. And of course, later we have in the the time of Queen Elizabeth and King James, actual monarchs themselves, right? A king or queen who was actually patronizing a particular company. Sometimes this was theoretical, though, and the actual connection between the noble person and the company was kind of spurious. Actual individuals owned stock in the company. So Shakespeare, for instance, would have stock in his own company. So you could make money not only by writing plays or acting in plays, but actually by being involved in a more financial sense. So despite the fact that theaters were often unruly places and many wanted them closed, they were not shut down for decades despite kind of public outcry until the English Civil War. In the 17th century, there's a civil war between monarchists and parliamentarians. Parliament ends up winning, and Oliver Cromwell becomes essentially kind of the dictator of England. And the parliamentary party were Puritans who believed that the theater was a kind of lewd and immoral place, and ultimately wanted to shut it down. Now, one of the at least potential reasons for this, of course, is that famously at the time, women were not allowed to act on stage. It was considered indecent, and so young boys filled the role of the women on stage, which meant that you had a very interesting cultural situation where young boys dressing up in women's clothing and playing women was a regular part of the dramatic life of the society. And it also is kind of interesting to think about when you read scenes from, say, Henry V between Catherine and Henry. Very interesting love scenes. It's hard to imagine it being performed between a man and a boy dressed as a woman. But that's one of those kind of cultural differences, which is perhaps difficult for modern people to kind of imagine in the sense that a 16th century person would have. But this is the world, right? It's a very vibrant, dramatic world in which the person, the man Shakespeare, enters. Now, to look at William Shakespeare himself, I would like to begin by looking at a quotation by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who says this: Shakespeare is the only biographer of Shakespeare. So far from Shakespeare's being the least known, he is one person in all of modern history fully known to us. So basically, he's arguing that by reading the works which Shakespeare produced, we get to an understanding of Shakespeare the man, even if we don't know a lot about him. But we actually know more about him than you might think. The information about Shakespeare's life is really quite substantial, at least for the time period. So although we do not have private writings from Shakespeare, the public output of Shakespeare is quite prolific. The plays which are accounted to him are usually around 37, at least. 150 plus sonnets, 2 narrative poems, The Rape of Lucretia and Venus and Adonis, and some shorter poems as well. So, again, quite a prolific career. He was born in 1564 and baptized on the 26th of April, with his actual day of birth traditionally ascribed to April 23rd, as usually it was 3 days after birth that a child would be baptized, in which case his birthday is ascribed to St. George's Day, which is not only the national day of England, as St. George is the patron saint of the country, but also is the day on which Shakespeare died, which is quite poetic. So Shakespeare and his wife Anne Hathaway had 3 children, and their last direct descendant, a granddaughter, died in 1670. So there aren't any more direct descendants of Shakespeare. So little is known of Shakespeare's life as a young man. He seems to have become a successful playwright before too long. But Shakespeare was both an actor and a playwright, and he worked for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which was a theatrical company under the patronage of the Lord Chamberlain, and he worked as both an actor and a playwright into the 1590s. Now, Shakespeare was not just posthumously regarded as a great playwright; he really was well known as one already in his own period. He was praised in his own time by people like William Camden as the pregnant wit of our times, right? There's the sense that his wit is pregnant, it's full of a kind of cleverness, which allows him to write these great plays. And Shakespeare himself was also a shareholder. He owned a share in the Blackfriars Theatre in London, and he was really a gentleman of note in that sense. As mentioned, he died on the 23rd of April, 1616, and we get there, again, this great kind of poetic consummation with the greatest playwright in the history of England dying on that national day, and also, potentially at least, the day in which he was born. Now, it is probably at this point that I should note that there are popular theories current. I'm sure you could find some quite readily on YouTube or at other places on the internet that purport that Shakespeare did not, in fact, write the plays which are ascribed to him. This theory first originated with a woman known called Delia Bacon in America in the 19th century. So it's really quite recent by historical standards, and she eventually went mad. So that says something perhaps about the theory. So despite the literature on the subject, indeed, you can not only find things on the internet, there are books written about this. It is not actually a historically credible position, and no respected historian would ascribe to it. The two most popular candidates for the actual writer of Shakespeare's plays are Francis Bacon and the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. Such theories often originate in assumptions that Shakespeare was not well educated enough to write the plays. Some people even argue that he was illiterate, and that clearly a noble person would have had to have written these plays. Otherwise, how could Shakespeare have known about life at court and all these other things? They're often based in very classist assumptions, believing that essentially a commoner would not be capable of writing plays like Shakespeare wrote. This is really, in fact, not accurate to what we know. Shakespeare was well educated in a grammar school, which was of very high quality. He would have certainly been taught Latin. He possibly may have even been taught a little bit of Greek. He would have read the classics, in some cases in the original language. And this kind of education is really something that is important to think about, to think that Shakespeare is not simply coming at this from just an English perspective, but that he is very much in this 16th century period involved in a classical education, which is giving him a basis for other kinds of patterns that we see in ancient Greek and Roman drama and even just history in general. So it is fully unsurprising that someone of Shakespeare's education and background would have been able to write the plays, and any serious scholar does not doubt that he indeed wrote them. There really is no evidence for the theories that purport that someone else wrote these plays. All right, so I just wanted to get that out of the way in case any of you are familiar with that theory or those collections of theories. So the first folio, as it is known, is a collection of Shakespeare's most popular plays, published very shortly after his death. It was published in 1623. Now, some plays survive in multiple manuscripts, which contain differences in the text. Famously, plays such as King Lear, Hamlet, and Othello have really quite different versions. Thus, it is important to remember that Shakespeare wrote his plays to be performed, and that he did not oversee authoritative print editions. For a modern playwright to write a play, it is, of course, expected that it will be published in an authoritative edition. It will be written with that in mind. Shakespeare did not do so. He wrote his plays as essentially working scripts. It is only later that they were put together and published because of their great popularity and literary renown. But what that means, of course, is that editors must often decide what forms the standard text. So famously, for instance, lines like from Romeo and Juliet, right, a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet, doesn't really quite exist in its most popularly known version in any of the versions that was kind of put together by an editor. This is less of a problem in the play which we will be looking at in further videos more extensively, which is Henry V. Henry V was probably written in 1599. The 1590s is really when Shakespeare's writing takes off, and around this period we have many of his greatest productions. The story of Henry V is set against the backdrop of what is known as the 100 Years' War, which is really a series of wars which lasts a little bit more than 100 years between France and England, with England claiming the right to the throne of France and making various incursions into France. More specifically, though, the background of Henry V is the famous Battle of Agincourt, which took place in 1415, in which a vastly outnumbered and starving and exhausted British army was successfully engaged with a larger French force, and ultimately led to, it seemed for a while, the victory of the English in that war, although it ultimately comes to naught and the English are defeated. It also forms part of what is called a tetralogy with Richard II and the plays Henry IV, Part 1, and Henry IV, Part 2. So in Richard II, we see the usurpation of the crown of England from the title character Richard II by the future, at least, Henry IV, known as Bolingbroke in the play, his cousin, the cousin of the king. We cannot get into the plot here, but suffice to say that due to perceived injustices against Henry by the King Richard, Henry seizes the throne for himself. This leads to a very precarious situation that we see in the next two plays, Henry IV's Part 1 and 2. Despite the fact that the title character is the king, Henry IV, and he is indeed a very important character, in many ways the actual protagonist is Hal. Hal is what Henry is known when he's younger, when he's the prince. And in these plays we see a dissolute youth. He frequents taverns and other places of ill repute. He's right often drunk. He involves in even criminal activity at times, and he seems to shirk the duty and responsibility of his station in life. And his father, in many ways, despairs that his son will amount to anything and will ever be worthy of being a proper king. He hangs around with low-level characters, such as, most famously, Falstaff. Falstaff is this large, fat, kind of jolly character, constantly drunk, constantly broke, constantly up to no good, but lovable with a kind of heart of gold in many ways. And this relationship forms the background to the Henry that we see in Henry V. As those plays come to an end, we see the death of Henry IV, and we see Hal, this dissolute youth who spent his time in rioting and drunkenness, forced to ascend to the highest place of duty and responsibility. And we see him reject quite explicitly his old, dissolute life. We see in perhaps the most dramatic moment from the Henry IV plays, Falstaff, who now believes that with his young friend as the king, he will be favored, call out to him, and we see Hal, now King Henry, say, "I know thee not, old man," and reject him. So the Henry that we see at the beginning of Henry V is very different than we see in these other plays. He is far more stern and severe. And indeed, it will be worth thinking what kind of a character he is, and particularly what kind of a hero he is. He is quite explicitly presented as a heroic figure in the play. He leads armies, he defeats his enemies, he does all the kind of heroic action that we would expect. There are troubling aspects as well of his character, and troubling decisions and actions that he takes. If we compare him with a hero such as, say, Thomas Moore in the play A Man for All Seasons, whose passivity is perhaps both his weakness and his strength, with Henry we have activity. His virtues are the virtues of action, courage and daring and self-sacrifice. But his vices, it seems, are the active kind as well, perhaps leading to a certain kind of cruelty and even severity in his action. Keep this in mind as in the further videos in the coming weeks, we go through the play of Shakespeare, Henry V, and consider exactly what kind of a hero it is that Shakespeare is holding up as this great man, or is he? Is he doing something more complex? We will return to this question in the next video as we look at Act 1 of Shakespeare's Henry V.